Let me welcome you at the conference East Matters, organized by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Warsaw and supported by Charles Mott Foundation and Open Society Foundation, represented here by Goran Budiowski, our great friend. Just let me refer for a second to the program, which I hope is
available to you in some form, for sure in a digital form on our website. The main part of the conference will be tomorrow. We're going to have 3 panels and extremely interesting guests also from Polish side. The only thing that I wanted to mention here now is that we have great guests. Ulrike Guérot, who is from the University of Krems in Austria, and the founder of European Lab in Berlin, European Democracy Lab in Berlin, and Jan-Werner Müller, University in Princeton, and the author of 2 books and that we published. But there is one more in Carl Schmitt and maybe one more. Probably there are many, and I'm doing faux pas now. But both are prominent speakers and worldwide known public intellectuals. I'm happy to welcome them here in Warsaw at the conference. Exactly. Thank you very much. We have published books a month ago by Ulrike and a few months ago by Jan. Both refer to the crisis of liberal democracy and European Union and the rise of populism. And actually we have probably, you can disagree with me, here represented 2 main schools of explanation why populists are so successful. One school, so-called culture matters, is more probably close to Jan. Or Jan is more close to this school, and economy matters would be probably that Ulrike is more here. We have also one more, at least in Poland, that Russia matters, but we can talk about it. And we decided to do some introductory remarks around the main thesis of the book, but also around the main events that happened after it. We have German elections still discussed in the press, professional and newspapers still. We have election in Czech, which is very interesting example of populism, so-called industrial populism or technocratic populism that I think is already discussed in the book of Jan. There's some similarities between technocracy and populism. We have also events interesting going on in Spain and so on. So I would like you to refer to the main thesis of your book and also to what would you change, or how do you comment from your own perspective this would have happened recently? Let's do it like 10 minutes, though I won't interrupt you if you will do it longer, a little bit, or shorter. Ulrike?
Yeah, many thanks for having me here at Krytyka Polityczna. Thanks to Sławomir for moderating us and to Jan-Werner Müller. In a way, it's a premiere because Jan and I are hanging around in Vienna, but never made it to a common panel in Vienna. He was first, or I was first, but we were always serial, or in Berlin, sort of same, but never together. So it's a sort of Warsaw premiere, and I'm very happy about this. To the book, or say the books. I mean, the book that Krytyka Polityczna, Adam Ziemiński translated is in a way, I wouldn't say the shortcut, but sort of a different angle into that idea of, European Republic in the sense of European democracy has to change. And perhaps to resume, because if we are now talking about what is happening now in Europe, and there are so many issues which are happening. Obviously, I come from the West. The theme here is East Matters. But it's because I also think that the East matters that I feel like I'm hanging around many times in Warsaw since 2 years. Yeah. So it's very interesting how often you come in the past months, for me, being a Franco-German girl in a way. Yeah, you see my point. So because I feel like in that momentum we are, where we discuss democracy in Europe, we discuss Macron, we discuss the Euro governance, we discuss Brexit, we discuss Catalonia and all these things. As a German, I shall say there is a huge risk for you, the Poles, the Czechs, the whatever, to be forgotten in the discussion. Because if one thing, then there is obviously that saying that the Euro needs to integrate more, and Macron does new things on Euro governance. So where's Poland then? Where is the East then in all these discussions? And because precisely in this book I argue that the East should not be forgotten, because we should not, whatever we do now, forget about the legacy of '89, which was Europe whole and free. This is an offer for discussion. So just to give that you as an entry point, sort of where I do stand, and how big are the cleavages, because it depends truly on in which town you are in Europe, sort of which argument you put on the table first, right? I mean, when you are in France, you do not start with the East matters, you start with Macron and whatever, yeah? So, and I think this is really a crucial moment where I think we should put all the European troubles together in one picture. What matters here for Poland? What matters for Hungary? What matters for populism, for democracy, for rule of law, for Catalonia, for Brexit, for Macron, and not play one sort of topic which is related to Europe against the other. And so, to make a long story short, I think if all these elements are fragments of a situation in time in which we probably come to think that the EU that we have started to grow and to conceive not has come to an end, but needs to be completed in the way of one market, one currency, one democracy, then democracy needs what? Democracy is more than a formal rule of majority. It's not sort of the tyranny of the street. Democracy has a functional binding. The functional binding is rule of law. The functional binding is moral, if you want so. Or the functional binding is res publica, the notion of what is a republic, which is a normative binding, and which means, applying it to European citizens, that my argument, my central argument in this book and in the other thicker book on the European Republic is that if we still have the project to formulate a political project for this continent and to call it a democracy, it would have one prerequisite. And the correct prerequisite is that over time we agree to be equal in front of the law. We no longer accept distinction after nationality on laws. We do, because in the current EU system, the EU is a hybrid sort of law space in which we do competition law, whatever. Market players are equal in that EU space. But we as citizens, we are not. You as Poles, I as German, Austrians, Finns, Portuguese, we are not equal in front of the law because we are fragmented into national law compartments. And it matters because we do not vote the European Parliament in the same way. We do not pay the same taxes. And at least for those being in the euro, I know that you wanted to be in the euro in 2011 and the euro crisis didn't make that happen. But imagine for a second you were in the euro. We have 1 euro, we have one IBAN number, we don't have one tax number. So there is a point about completion, and the completion argument is also the paradigm change, which I think Macron did in his 2 last speeches. Because if you read these speeches carefully, Macron was no longer about integrating. Macron was about souveraineté, unité, démocratie. And that is really a paradigm change, and it is a new wording. I do think actually it is a compelling offer for the reorganization of the democracy on this continent. Having said that, everybody can perhaps leave the EU, but then you are still around on the European continent and no country can run away. So the question of how we reorganize European democracy is on the table. And my pledge is that we organize this democracy in Europe, not East against West, but with the East, which would mean that ultimately, and that I want to hear from you, whether there is any perspective that you are still ambitious to join the euro in some point soon, which I think you should, because then the completion argument, one market, one currency, one democracy, I think would be vivid and would be, say, palpable also for Polish, Czech, other citizens. Why I'm saying this? Because if not, I think we do suffer, and that is this book which is on the market, the New Civil War. We are in a process of being instrumentalized in new waves of renationalization. The central argument I make is we are not in a renationalization period, but what is really happening is that countries are split, meaning that I have more in favor of somebody in Poland who's demonstrating against the peace government that I have or I share with some German who are demonstrating with Pegida in Dresden. So I think we are in a historical process where for the first time we organize ourselves as European citizens on political grounds and not on nationality grounds. So we are basically coming closer to what Stefan Zweig once said, which is that Europe is no distinction on the ground of nationality. If that is true, and you can put into the field many of this, like Brexit, like Catalonia, like in essence what counts is, are you a European citizen? Because the notion of European citizenship leads straight to the notion of sovereignty. Neither the EU is sovereign, not the nation state is sovereign. Sovereign in its essence, if you start from Jean Baudin, the readings, is always only the citizens. So the argument I make and I suggest is that could it not be that we are in a historical moment where the task, sort of like in a birth channel, and the task which is in front of us, at a moment in time where the EU system seems overstretched in the Brexit case, in the Catalonian case, overstretched perhaps in this European Court regulation on refugees, because there's a question on sanctioning power. What if the European Court, which wants to push through the distribution key on refugees, what if the Poles and the Hungarians still do not want these refugees? I mean, who has, in the Max Weberschen sense, who has the legitimate monopoly of power? That is the question. And I think we are in a moment of history where the European Union, or the European citizens, as the sovereign of the political body or the political polity we want to be in, that we decide the question, quid governandum, who decides, and the question, who's the sovereign. And that would require that we think hard how to restructure the institutional system, how to get it parliamentarized, how to build a parliament which has right of initiative, how to get a government which we can outvote if the government is not running policies that we like, and how to represent the people, the citizens of Europe. And here we can discuss this perhaps in the discussion. The regions come in. Is it necessarily that the nation states of today are the only thinkable institutional carrier of the political body we have? Or is it thinkable that regions like Catalonia, Scotland, whatever, could form another political body which is not composed by nation states, which are in some way only aggregates of many nations? If you look at Italy or Germany or even the UK, which is with 4 football teams in the Champions League, so you can easily ask the question, what is a nation, right? Is Scotland a nation and Wales because they have a football team in the European Champions League? So I think all these questions are on the table, and the risk is obviously that we don't get this done, this sort of transnational organization or reorganization of the European democracy, because it's difficult. There's language. I mean, it's problematic. And risk, and here we are with, can democracy be saved? That's the question of your conference tomorrow. I think in times of stress, what is happening is that collectivities go to the last level of regression. You go back to what you once experienced as the last good moment in time. And obviously in these times of stress, this is the nation state, which has been the sort of warm bed for social distribution, for whatever, for your traumatic experience moving out of USSR, and so on and so forth. So I think you can observe in the moment of stress, where I think we need to go through a sort of historical needle ear together, it's obvious that we fall back into this regression called nationalization. And then I stop last sentence, I would argue in analogy to what happened, say, 100 years ago, and that is why we all have these discussions on the loss of democracy, on populism, how can it happen, the split of the left, the right which conquers the street, all these analogies that we can make with the Weimar Republic, I think it should not be forgotten, and that is what Sławomir said about my sort of economic focus, that what happened, I guess, in a nutshell last century is that there was a huge moment of, say, societal, technological and industrial modernization, because we went from rural societies to basically industry societies, and we couldn't work this out, and so we worked it out against each other, and we made, militarism and war out of it, before then creating in 1957 a common market. So if now much of the stress that the societies have comes from robotics, algorithms, loss of jobs, so we are basically in a different loop of modernization, societal modernization, I think the question on the table is, do we go through that loop this time together as European citizens, and can we work this out in a new form of European democracy rather than going back to regression into whatever form of nationalism and populism? And so my offer for discussion is that we should not do that, and that we should go for a European Republic, Rzeczpospolita Europejska.
Great. Great pronunciation. Jan?
So now for something completely different. I'll put up 3 theses for discussion, 2 which are in the book. 1 is a commentary on what we've been witnessing in the year 2017. First thesis. Conventional wisdom in our day has it that populists are those who, as the very cliched phrase goes, criticize or rise up against the elites or the establishment. Seems completely obvious, and yet when you think about it, it's a very strange thought. Up until recently, everybody would have said it's a sign of being a good democratic citizen that you keep a close eye on the powerful in politics, in the economy, maybe even also in culture. All of a sudden, beginning of the 21st century, we're told that anybody who actually does that is automatically a danger to democracy. It can't be as simple as that. Of course, when populists are in opposition, they criticize governments, they criticize the powerful. But above all, they do something else. They always claim in one way or another that they, and only they, represent what populists typically call the real people, or also very typically the silent majority. Now, at first sight you might say, that doesn't sound so bad. That's not immediately the same thing as racism, not immediately the same thing as, let's say, fanatical hatred of the European Union. And yet, I think it always immediately also has 2 detrimental consequences for democracy. First of all, it means that populists also always claim that all other contenders for power are fundamentally illegitimate. And there, populists immediately make it personal, and they make it moral. It's never just about disagreements on policy or even values, which after all is completely normal and hopefully productive in a democracy. No, the problem is always immediately that the others are corrupt or, to coin a phrase, crooked. The kinds of things that Donald Trump said about the other contender in the presidential election 15-16, to be sure, were an extreme. But they were not truly an exception. I think the kinds of things that he said, all populists say in one form or another. Secondly, and maybe less obviously, populists will also say that all those citizens, all those, if you like, among the people themselves, who do not share their ultimately symbolic construction of the allegedly real people, and who logically then do not support the populists politically, that all those citizens can have their status as properly belonging to the people put into doubt. Let me give you 2 quick examples to make that perhaps less obvious thought plausible. Many of you will remember how still during the night of Brexit, Nigel Farage said that this had been, as he put it, a victory for real people. Implying, of course, that the 48% who wanted to stay inside the Union, well, on one level, aren't quite real. Do not properly belong to the British, or maybe in the case of Farage, specifically the English people. All think back to a campaign speech of Donald Trump in May 16, which was virtually ignored given all the other sexist and racist things that he kept saying during the campaign. But it was a sentence that was actually deeply revealing. Trump said, I'm quoting from memory, the most important thing is the unification of the people, and all the other people don't matter. I hope you can see where this is going. The populist can decide whether somebody belongs or doesn't belong, irrespective of whether they legally belong, have the right passport, and so on. So long story short, the first thesis is that the important thing about populism is not anti-elitism. Any of us can criticize elites, doesn't mean we're always right, but there's nothing automatically dangerous about that. The crucial feature is anti-pluralism. The crucial feature is that populists always exclude at the level of party politics, other politicians, and less obviously at the level of the people themselves and citizens. Second thesis. Conventional wisdom also has it that populists maybe aren't really able to govern. Liberals very often say that these are basically always protest movements. And by definition, once you're in power, you cannot keep protesting against yourself. All people say, well, look, they're always anti-elitist. Once you are in government, you have become the elite, so you have to seize your anti-elitist discourse. Or another thought, beloved by liberals, all their policy ideas are so unbelievably simplistic and deficient that on day one of their time in government, it's going to become completely obvious to the whole world that nothing is going to work, nothing is going to get implemented, the wall will not be built, free trade agreements will not be rescinded, and so on and so forth. I think we have enough examples in our day, and I hesitate to lecture a Polish audience on examples in this regard, of populists governing specifically as populists, which in my sense mean as anti-pluralists, which furthermore means as actors who do not, at the end of the day, recognize the legitimacy of an opposition. I think what we've also, by now, could conclude is that if you put all the examples together, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, perhaps by now also India, Venezuela, to some degree even the US nowadays, you might even speak of, if the term weren't so perverse, a populist art of governance. I'll just mention a few features and we can go back to this if you like. Some of it is pretty obvious. It's obvious that all these governments, as soon as they are criticized by independent, non-elected institutions, whether they be constitutional courts or free media, will immediately always shoot back by saying, who elected you? We and only we represent the people, and if we have enough power, and if the countervailing forces aren't strong enough, we will actually, in practice, try to weaken these independent institutions. Again, I'm reluctant to say more about this, given where we are and what you've all experienced in this country recently. But secondly, and maybe less obviously, these kinds of actors will also ultimately try to capture the state itself and replace what in theory should be a neutral bureaucracy with their own people, to put it very bluntly. Now, some of you might come back to me and say, well, yeah, okay, but plenty of parties sort of try to do that. That's not specifically populist. True, but the difference is that these populist governments can do it very openly, and with what in their mind is actually a moral argument. After all, the state should be there for the people, and they allegedly are the only representatives of the people. So it's only right and proper that they take possession of the state. Thirdly, it's also very typical in all these cases that these populist governments engage in what political scientists call mass clientelism. Let's give benefits and bureaucratic favors to those citizens who support us, everybody else gets nothing. Again, you might come back to me and say, well, plenty of parties do that. I mean, that's sort of almost normal in democracies, that you reward your base. There's nothing strange about that. Again, true, but something that normally people try to hide is again done very openly, and with what, in the eyes of populists, amounts to a moral argument. Because remember that from the get-go, not all the people are the real people. So the fact that only the real people get benefits and everybody else gets nothing is not something to be ashamed of. It's actually how things should be. And this, if I'm permitted a tiny footnote, might be a possible explanation, but I only say possible explanation. I can't prove this to you, it may be empirically wrong, but I hope that somebody some social scientists will eventually look into this, a possible explanation of what otherwise seems very, very difficult to make sense of. I'm talking about the fact that, of course, a lot of these populist parties, initially when they're in opposition, come out as the great crusaders against corruption. Then they get into power, and it turns out they are 10 times as corrupt as the previous elites. And you would have, from a very sort of commonsensical point of view, thought that must be politically deadly. I mean, if, let's say the Freedom Party in Austria still today is facing plenty of lawsuits from Jörg Haider's time in power in Carinthia, or if, Erdogan is caught on tape saying certain things, one would have thought that's deadly for these kinds of parties. As we all know, it isn't. So maybe, from the point of view of supporters, what we think of as corruption isn't corruption at all. They are just doing the right thing for the real people. Maybe the fact that they get something too on the side is a sort of legitimate reward for what they've done for the real people. As I said, just a hypothesis, but something that I think needs to be explained somehow. Last element, again, probably entirely obvious to everybody in this room, but clearly very much part of this populist art of governance. When there is protest, when civil society, if you like, rises up against these types of governments and regimes, it becomes, not least morally and symbolically, extremely important for these populist actors to discredit that protest as comprehensively as possible, even if it's no real threat to their power. Why? Once again, from their point of view, they are the only legitimate representatives of the people. It cannot be that parts of the people themselves are really rising up against their only legitimate representatives. So hence, as again all of you know, everybody has basically followed the strategy that Putin pioneered of basically saying, what you see out there, of course, aren't really citizens demonstrating in good faith. Everything is paid for and manipulated by somebody on the outside. Of course, usually, one gets a certain cast of characters being trotted out. It's the CIA, it's Soros, but there are no limits to creativity. Remember, for instance, how in the context of the Gezi Park protests, Turkish government immediately came out saying, look, you think it's ordinary Turkish citizens? No, it's all been organized by Lufthansa. Why? Because they were afraid of more competition from Turkish airlines, given that Erdogan built this new airport. So you can come up with a lot of interesting stuff. What maybe is a little bit less obvious is that these regimes, I think, have also become a lot more sophisticated in making protest work for them. By that I mean that a lot of them basically find ways of incorporating protest into their own narrative of an ongoing culture war. Let me give you one quick example. You all remember how millions of people came out in the United States against the so-called Muslim travel ban. And at the time there was a sense that, look, this is already a big blow to Trump. And I'm not saying that it wasn't deleterious. But I can easily imagine Stephen Bannon at the time sitting in the White House saying, bingo, good thing that all these liberal, homeland-betraying, homeland-hating potential traitors on both coasts have come out and shown themselves. And if something goes wrong, we know who to blame. And we again have a perfect occasion to tell our real people that they are the real America and these other people are not. All think back to April this year. Big demonstrations against the possible closure of Central European University in Budapest. Lots of us, in retrospect, maybe naively thought that this was an important moment. What did the government say? Okay, the Soros network has finally shown itself. We've pulled them out in the open. It's more than we thought, but of course it's still a tiny minority. And here are the real Hungarian people, and this is just a bunch of basically alien characters who are marching out there. God forbid, I'm not saying, therefore we shouldn't protest. But I think we have to become more cognizant, more sophisticated about how the responses from the other side also have become, in a sense, more clever, more sophisticated, and so on. Last and final thesis. You all remember how up until March 16th, to be precise, of the year 2017, we were told everywhere that there was now an unstoppable wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom the wave was apparently too small a metaphor, put it, a tsunami of populism that was going to wash away the elites everywhere. You all know what the story looked like. First Brexit, then Trump, then allegedly Geert Wilders, then Marine Le Pen, and then God knows what in Germany. Come the Dutch elections, the story entirely was turned around. All of a sudden, newspapers were full of learned treatises on how we were already living in the post-populist moment. And then come autumn, the story becomes sort of more mixed again, and we're not quite sure where we are. So how to make sense of this? Well, with all due respect to Nigel Farage, he didn't bring about Brexit all by himself. After all, he needed his very established, conservative, and I use the term consciously, collaborators. He needed his Boris Johnson. Well, Boris Johnson is a bit eccentric too, but think of somebody like Michael Gove, the man who famously went on British television in spring of 2016 saying, "This country is tired of experts," which, just as a footnote, is of course not least interesting because Michael Gove was always perceived as an intellectual among Tories. So it wasn't just anybody, you picked up randomly from the street who told people, don't trust expertise. It took an expert to tell people credibly that expertise is overrated. In the case of the US, at the risk of saying the blindingly obvious, Donald Trump did not become president as the candidate of a new third grassroots protest movement of angry white workers. No, he was the candidate of a very established party. He needed figures you all remember, like Chris Christie, Rudy Giuliani, and Newt Gingrich, to basically tell citizens he might be a bit funny, but ultimately he is our candidate. And again, it's maybe interesting to remember a moment when Gingrich went on television during the Republican convention and said the usual thing about, crime is going through the roof, carnage everywhere. To which the CNN journalist said, but look, the FBI statistics are showing the opposite. To which Gingrich said, you may believe in what theorists say. Which sort of was news to most of us, that the FBI is full of theorists and philosophers, but never mind. You may believe in what theorists say. I believe in what people feel. And again, it was maybe worth remarking that whatever else you think about him, in the context of the American conservative movement, Gingrich is an intellectual. This is somebody who writes books, who has futurological studies and so on. It took an expert to tell people that expertise is overrated. And as, again, banal as it might sound, the prime factor that explains what happened on November 8th last year is not a big story about the white working class. It's partisanship. It's the fact that 90% of self-identified Republicans came out and voted for Trump. Had he not been the Republican candidate, he would not be president. So long story short, all I'm trying to say is that up until today, nowhere in Western Europe or North America has a right-wing populist come to power without the collaboration of conservative elites. And what the story about the unstoppable wave completely missed out on is the fact that populism is not some natural force now that is unstoppable or some sort of, energy center that will simply, pull everything down. No, it always depended on the larger dynamic and the choices of other actors. Of course, in Austria, we might now see how a conservative, again, decides to collaborate and bring right-wing populists to power. Last thing, if I may. The reason why the story about the post-populist moment is also misleading is the following. If you find anything worthwhile in what I've been trying to say about populism basically consisting of a kind of claim to a moral monopoly of representing the people, then this is prima facie different from particular policy content. So if you tell me what you think about refugees or about the Euro crisis, I cannot, from my perspective of this account, tell you you are or you aren't a populist. Policies in and of themselves are not populist or not. At the same time, of course, anybody who has this anti-pluralist attitude needs content. They need to explain who the real people are. So therefore, it's not surprising that, let's say, right-wing populists say certain things about immigration, refugees, and so on. But they're still two different things. Why am I belaboring the point? I'm belaboring the point because we can have outcomes, like in the Netherlands, where our official populist, Geert Wilders, as the phrase in March went, didn't win. But at the same time, we have a situation where our supposedly liberal, mainstream, responsible Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, put ads in all Dutch newspapers saying, behave normally or leave the country. This is after his own Liberal Party in the 80s had the slogan, be yourself. So they've come a long way. In other words, yes, officially the populists can lose. But populist content, if you like, or something that has a very strong affinity with populism can still win. Because this is clearly almost pure Wilders. I mean, with all due respect, it's not the job of the Dutch Prime Minister to define cultural normality in the Netherlands. Yes, everybody obeys the law, obviously, but beyond that, that's not what we should get from the very top. So, my plea, by way of conclusion, is that we have to get away from this unbelievably simplistic way of now looking at every single election in Europe or maybe even around the globe, and the only question we ever ask is, oh, is populism up or is populism down? No, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I hope we can get into some of the further complications later on.
Thank you very much for very interesting remarks. I will have at least one question exactly to what you have said now, with the extension in the books, of course. But to you, Ulrike, I would like you to answer to the empirical data that we have now. I mean, I refer now to the election in the Czech Republic and also actually to the election in Poland, because both these countries were great economic results. Especially Czech, there is actually no unemployment there. It's like 2.9% economic surplus in the budget, and all the other data are actually the best in Europe now. Okay, and what you have is like from the Czech movie. You know, if you look at the first 5 top places in a parliament, the Babiš party, then the very Eurosceptic former Václav Klaus party, then the third extreme far right party, then Czech communists, and actually the socialists are only 5th or 6th. But the same situation was actually in Poland. What Platforma achieved is if you look at the figures, is that 2014, it's the best economic result concerning the growth, accumulated growth, aggregated growth in the entire OECD. Almost 25%. Then the deficit goes from 8 to less than 3%, the budget deficit, and unemployment twice lower than before, from 15 to about 8. And you can ask about inequalities. Inequalities didn't grow in both of these countries. And if you look at the broader picture, there actually is no correlation between economic results and the rise of populism. No matter what or at least no correlation between economic system that you have. No matter if it is what kind of capitalism you take, actually the populists are doing quite well everywhere, even if they're not winning election, because they can win election not by their own hands. And in the same time, you focus actually very strongly on economy. So how would you answer to what have happened both in Poland and in Czech Republic from your own perspective?
Yeah, thanks for the question. To be honest, I didn't check data on the economy before coming here. So, but I still think I have some sort of elements for answer. The first is when you were going down the list of who won what in Czech Republic, yeah, the socialists or the social democrats, obviously, yeah, coming out, 4th, 5th party. I think there is a generalized crisis of social democratic parties. I mean, we are hanging around as scientists with that question for 10, 15 years. Why can't social democratic parties no longer cater to their electorate? There's a big why. We don't know. I mean, why did Hamon lose France and basically up to a point where the French socialists need to sell Solferino in Paris? What about Martin Schulz, who started like with this hype and is now down to why only the Corbyn and Sanders figures, who are more socialist or socialist Democrats, are these sort of entertainer winning great people which enlighten the youth, but why social democratic parties can no longer win across, I mean, in the East as in the West. There is a big thing here. I think we know from history, and Jan has been writing this book about, political thought in the 20th century, but if the left splits, the street goes to the right. And this seems to be the pattern. We know it from Eribon, like when the French workers lose the pride of being French workers, then they vote Marine Le Pen. They don't vote Mélenchon. So this polarization is obviously what is happening beyond East and West divide, which I find very interesting. And then the second point, I think, relates straight to what Jan has been elaborating on. If you look at Czech Republic and Bagiš Party, is the factor of instrumentalization. Instrumentalization because you need collaboration of the conservatives and you need collaboration of, say, the wealthier sort of elites, the conservative wealthy elites. And here's the explanation that I give in my book. And I just add that point to what Jan has said about the collaboration factor. First, if we look at Austria, I mean, you talked about Geert Wilders. But you can say that Sebastian Kurz is the Wolfs im Schafpelz of FPÖ, because to win, he basically doubled the FPÖ on the right side, right? So Sebastian Kurz on refugees, on whatever, is not a bit better than the FPÖ is, just he seems more harmless. And so it's precisely what Jan said about, these arguments come and win, even if the Populist Party does not win itself so much. The same, and even more interestingly, is true for Germany. If you remember, I mean, this is 5 years back, but you remember that the FDP had plained against the own government which would support the Greeks' bailouts. And they had a Urabstimmung within the FDP. So there was a sort of anti-Euro establishment, which were the conservatives, the money establishment of Germany, the industry and Mittelstand. And they run an anti-Euro argument within the FDP in 2011-2012. After the Urabstimmung, the AfD was founded by those who didn't win the suit, right? So in a way, and that is also the collaboration argument, it was part of the wealthier conservative establishment of Germany that helped the AfD to grow. Because the modernization losers, if you say the argument is not that there's no direct relation between the losers of modernization and sort of right-wing parties. I agree, but I agree only in the first hand, because you have a certain, level of modernization losers, say the workers in France, or say the Germans in the eastern part of Germany, and those alone cannot rise up to political momentum. But by the moment that they are lifted by the conservative establishment, then it gets a movement. And so I think what we can observe is that European populism, be that left, East or West European, always comes on two legs. There's not a monocausal economic explanation, but it always comes as an economic and cultural explanation at a moment in time, and that is my argument, that when the more bourgeois, or say conservative forces of a country realize that, say, integration Europe, social Europe, democratic Europe costs money, they shy away themselves in delivering this because it's easier and cheaper for them to basically fuel populist parties and right-wing nationalism because it's cheaper for them. I mean, let's be very precise. Alice Weigel, who is a lesbian, married with a Philippine woman, having the little son of this other Philippine lady, having lived in China, taxation in Switzerland, is now running folkish arguments, racist arguments in Germany. So either she's completely schizophrene about what she does and what she says, or she has an interest in doing so because in sense of vested self-interest, she knows that there's something to look for, majorities. So if she fuels the majorities, she wins what? An interesting life for herself because she can run a sort of prominent and ever more prominent party in Germany. So if you are smart, normally smart people want money, sure, but smart people want money and power, yeah? So you can make an argument out of vested self-interest of national conservatives elite, fueling populist and nationalist arguments, because out of vested self-arguments, because it's just there and they can lift it. I give you another example, Thierry Baudet. You know, I think, for instance, if we look at the Netherlands, that people like Thierry Baudet are much more, say, dangerous in a way than Geert Wilders. Yeah? Geert Wilders, whatever, you know. But Thierry Baudet is a 30-something, studied in Washington, is completely cosmopolitan, totally smart, and runs on that national argument in the Netherlands with, you know, Singaporeization of the Netherlands, we are sort of new Catalonia, let's go it alone argument. And that is seducing. So I totally take the point of Jan-Werner Müller, who talks about collaboration, or to frame it a little differently, about instrumentalization of a populist sort of, nationalist, taste which is in the air, and then elites buying into it to bring it to power. It only can happen when the cultural and the economic argument link together. When basically, and I think for Germany this is totally evident, that also Christian Lindner in the last election was trying to fish in the waters of AfD with this anti-Euro resistant sort of, you know, talk, a little bit like Sebastian Kurz was fishing in the waters of FPÖ. And why? Because if you are a liberal, conservative, say middle-class, small company owner, why should you pay for a democratic and social Europe and give taxation for European unemployment scheme? It's easier for you to fuel nationalist and populist people, and then you give them a neoliberal agenda like Alice Weidel does, and so you lure people into populism because that's your cheap argument to not pay for a social and democratic Europe. It's easy to offer a flag and we are America first, Germany first, Dutch first, because in a way it allows you on the economic side to not pay for social democracy, and this is why democracy is flawed in these days. It is why democracy can no longer cater to its electorate. Because then we can talk endlessly, and that would be another sort of topic point here. Then you talk about, you know, knowledge orders, Foucault's campaigning strategies, bots attacks, and how it works in the internet now. But if now in Germany a nurse with an average salary of, say, whatever, 20,000 or 30,000 euros a year, yeah, believes that she is a super middle class earner, and if Martin Schulz wins, she will lose taxation, then there's something wrong in the discourse, yeah? Because you cannot even make for lower classes the argument that taxation is necessarily, and taxation is for the rich and the wealthy, and they should tax. I'm living in a country, Bundesrepublik Deutschland, which since 1998 has no more heritage and fortune tax, which should be having that because it's in the Constitution, Article 8, I think, Eigentum verpflichtet. So there's nothing wrong about having a fortune tax. We just skipped it in 98 for a little legal sort of issue, and since then never reintroduced it. Yeah. So all I'm saying here, if now you want to reintroduce it, like Martin Schulz wanted, the nurse thinks that she's taxed, which is completely absurd. So I think we should pose questions about the narratives and sort of the logics of elections and who can do what. Perhaps just to end this argument, if you say there's no relation between the economic situation and the populist vote, I would argue at least there are two realities. Because the thing today is that both is right. It is true that Germany is very wealthy these days, has a tax overflow and is growing. And it is true that we have income spreads and poverty in Germany as never before. So there are two realities. And what you see is basically where you look. And if that is true, then the reality you are living in is your bubble reality of Facebook and so on and so forth, then it's really difficult to navigate with policies who can sort of reach out to basically, the whole political body of people. So I think that is pretty much an explanation when the cultural and the economic argument clinch together, and when the bourgeois sort of liberal, conservative money elites go for instrumentalization of populism and nationalism, rather than lifting people up to what Willy Brandt once called that Politik ist die Arbeit an der Vernunft.
2 points to two questions to Jan. First, if you prefer the second edition of your book, I have dozens of new quotations for you. Be it the question of who is real and who is not. We have Gorsze Sort, the worst sort, which is the general name for all of us here sitting. And so some more, and also for the combined elites that showed finally themselves, and it's a proof that we were right, and so on. And it's again entire nomenclature for it. So already Peace is one of the main characters of your book, but like we have a new scenario or new chapter. But I have 2 points. And also to confirm one thing is that you are totally right. Also, I experienced this kind of first disappointment and too early relief concerning the question of populism after the results in the Netherlands. And in France specifically, because not everybody knows about the internal situation in the Netherlands. This open letter to the public, not only advertisements by Rutte, was obvious to me that he got his momentum once he's absorbed the narrative of Wilders, which is not really the win of anyone else than populism. So a few weeks ago I was in a panel with Verhofstadt, and Verhofstadt was giving his a little bit populist, at least in form, speech that, well, had we see each other a year before, we will all be crying, and so on, because here are Brexit, here are those who were talking that it's a one nightmare, that it's a never-ending story, and so on, and people were laughing, and it was very funny. But then he said, and look, we're getting better, we're almost there, and so on. But then when I asked him, like, please make sure who really won those elections in Austria and in France. All of the candidates, not only the winners, but the main candidates were people out of the mainstream, both in Austria. Actually, all candidates in French election, all four came out of the mainstream. It were people who in pre-elections were actually the runners who were unexpected, not only to win, but also even to come. Okay, and then they won. Same. Actually, also if you look at the results of the mainstream parties in Germany, it's the worst in a history. So it doesn't show you that, it's getting better for the former rulers. But my question would be, you refer actually, although you refer to the crisis of party systems, you don't actually extend your point. You don't go farther with this, even if you are criticizing the people like the school of Laclau or Chantal Mouffe on these radical Democrats. I would like to actually distinguish them. I see the difference between when Chantal Mouffe is criticizing the mainstream parties and the lack of a difference between them and so on, and the populist reason by Laclau. So when they are trying to talk about the solutions, here I agree with you more. But actually, how would you answer the big question? How to reform the party systems? Do you really believe that it will survive? Because you agree that liberal democracy is about party systems, that twin brothers. So this would be my first question to you. And the second question is not to challenge your point, but rather just I'm curious about it. Is your point that populism formal, not really substantial? This is when is it a good abbreviation of what you're talking about populism? Because it's extremely interesting. If so, then my question would be about refugees. Because again, you're a little bit omitting this point, which is a huge problem for each country.
3 hours now to explain how I'm going to reform the party systems everywhere?
If it's a real explanation, then 3 minutes should be enough.
Okay.
But you can take 13.
All right. So, actually, let me say one thing that relates actually to this point, to what Ulrike was saying. So, I completely agree that there cannot be a monocausal explanation about the rise of populism. And in a sense, it's a very strange expectation that we would have one, because we always, I include you now if I may, we always say, oh, these populists are so simplistic. But then, when they give us a one-sentence explanation about their own success, whether it's, losers of modernization, globalization, or people hate foreigners, or whatever it is, we also very often just buy it, because it makes our life easier too. If it was such a simple story about, oh, everywhere it's this one cause. So I completely agree that we need much more complicated stories. At the same time, at the risk of contradicting myself, I don't think that, the decline of social democracy is such an enormous mystery. In many places, I think it's clear enough that they simply have a massive credibility problem after the third way. And that you basically need something like in the UK, when basically momentum hijacks this dinosaur called Labour Party and somehow gives people the sense that, okay, it's not Blair all over again, that people have a different sense. Now, concretely, maybe it also means that Social Democrats need the equivalent of the wall, by which I mean you need at least a very strong symbolic statement to kind of convince people that you mean it. In the same way that in the US, I think it has become clear now from many studies, that there was a significant constituency that basically wanted Trump-style arguments about immigration. But they didn't vote for Romney, because they didn't believe him. They didn't believe that self-deportation was a credible policy in terms of getting rid of so-called illegals. When Trump said, I'll build a wall, people said, yes, that's it. We believe that. Whether he actually does it or not is a different question still. But something of that sort of magnitude of kind of establishing your credibility as a social democrat who means it. Anyway, I'm evading your question. What about party systems? So first of all, I don't believe, even though that's a very strong tendency, that the decline of so-called mainstream parties or particular people's parties automatically means that democracy is in crisis. Absolutely not. These people don't have a monopoly of representation over, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years. No. To say that, just because they are less than 50% or they don't make it into the second round of a presidential election, therefore we have a crisis of representation? No, absolutely not. Because if conversely then, we have situations as, let's say, in Greece and Spain, people also say, it's a new party that is successful. That's also a crisis of representation. But if the old parties persist, people say, it's post-democracy, so it's also a crisis of representation. So whatever happens, the conclusion is always crisis of representation. So that can't be right.
Who is the third actor, if not populists and not mainstream parties then?
Well, let me give you an example. And you might disagree with this. You might disagree with the categorization. But let's take the example of Spain. I think that before the rise of Podemos and Ciudadanos, it was very plausible to say, what is this democracy where we have two so-called mainstream parties which are becoming ever more similar, which actually, as we all know now, were corrupt. So not everybody who criticizes somebody else as corrupt is therefore automatically a populist, because lo and behold, there can actually be corruption. And it was a very good argument to make that, this comes pretty close to a diagnosis of post-democracy. Then what happens? Young people demonstrate on squares, then they found a party, then they go to elections, as has been empirically shown. They mobilize lots of young, well-educated people who basically said bye-bye to Spanish democracy. They go back to the polls, and most amazingly, they lose, and they accept it, and they go home, and they say, we'll try again. None of these things are obvious. You only need to think back to the 1970s in Western Europe to perhaps have the thought that young people who really are frustrated with a particular system could have other ideas than founding parties and dutifully accepting a loss. I mean, we haven't talked about this tonight, but the role of the loser in a democracy is absolutely crucial, and whether you accept an outcome or not. Populists, for the most part, don't. Because in a sense, if you find anything worthwhile in my approach, they have an almost logical problem. If on the one hand, they and only they represent the people, it can't be true that they don't succeed at the ballot box or don't get overwhelming majorities. So it's absolutely typical of these sorts of actors to basically I mean, I'm stylizing the story a little bit, but I hope you can see what I'm trying to say, to go back to that infamous notion of the silent majority and say, well, look, if the majority hadn't stayed silent, we would always already be in power. The fact that we're not shows that maybe we're not talking about a silent majority, but a silenced majority. In other words, the liberal elites must have been manipulating things behind the scenes, because it cannot be true that we lost. Yeah, I mean, this is, just two brief examples why this is such an issue. I mean, remember how Trump in November last year basically said, whether I accept it if she wins, I'll tell you at the time. Of course, everybody understood exactly what that meant. 70% of Trump's supporters said if Hillary Clinton wins this election, it must have been rigged. Now, that's a bad sign for any democracy, that basically so many losers or potential losers are saying, we don't trust this, we don't trust the system. Or one brief example from Austria, although it only really works nicely in German. Norbert Hofer, the man of the people in the presidential election, in the end had to concede defeat to, God forbid, an old green professor from Vienna with, dubious ethnic heritage. That cannot really be true. So he, at one point, said about his opponent, ist gezählt, aber ist nicht gewählt. So yes, the numbers add up for him, but he hasn't really been elected. Now, with all due respect, there's no such dichotomy in a democracy. Unless you're Carl Schmitt. Yes, then you can say there is this sort of banal statistical number stuff that liberals do, but there's also something deeper. The people in their existential, metaphysical, whatever, true nature, they can actually elect a politician in a different way. So I'm partly pointing at that because what I'm trying to say is that even if populists don't win, here's another cost that they exact. Here's another kind of damage they do to a political culture, because they constantly suggest to their supporters everything is a facade, everything is rigged. Now, don't get me wrong. Any of us can criticize our election systems. There's plenty to criticize, especially, but not only in the US. What you can't do is, like populists say, because I didn't win, our system is wrong. That's not a democratic argument. Anyway, back to your point. All I was trying to say in a long-winded way is that an example like Spain, for me at least, is basically pointing us in the direction of a possible renewal of party systems. So yes, you can say that mainstream parties are declining, but that doesn't equate to a crisis of democracy. In a certain way, it shows the exact opposite. It shows the capacity of these systems to renew themselves. Now, you're going to come back to me and say, but look, I can vote for, let's say Tsipras 20 more times, and nothing ever changes. In fact, it's even worse maybe than before. True, but then let's at least be precise about where that crisis of representation is, because then it's not in the national system. There has been renewal in these societies. Whatever you think about the particular parties, whether you like them or not, it's very hard, I think, to say that, nothing has really changed. But the problem is then, or the crisis then, is at the level of the EU, where basically opposition within the system cannot articulate itself, so opposition becomes opposition not within, but to the system as a whole. And so we can go maybe into an EU discussion again. But that's where I would see a potential future. And to give a one-sentence answer, I promise, on your second question, yes, it's a formal definition, and it's basically saying, look, this is sort of what we have to look out for, and ideally, I mean, this is a pious hope, but ideally, we might also be able to say, look, you populists, not everything you say is unacceptable in a democracy. It's not what you and I like. But, if you say, I want to reduce immigration or I have a very conservative position on family policy, I don't like it. But I cannot simply say, it's undemocratic. You cannot be in the system at all. But ideally, you would then get to a point where you say to these parties, look, fine, you represent people who have these views. But you got to play by the rules. And you cannot at the same time constantly assert that you are actually the people as a whole, and that everything is rigged, and that in the German case, we live, in a situation which is comparable to the late GDR, where, everything is it's fake pluralism and so on. You got to stop that, and then, we can talk differently. If you don't stop that, we're going to keep calling you out on this particular kind of anti-pluralist rhetoric, and we're going to treat you differently. It's not that we don't talk to you, but we're not going to pretend that you're like any other normal party. In a sense, I mean, it completely failed, but remember how the Austrian Social Democrats at one point said, we're going to have a catalogue of criteria, where we basically say, if you want to have a coalition with us, this is what you're going to have to do, and this is sort of how you're going to have to change. And at least in the abstract, in theory, to me that seemed not a bad idea, to basically give an incentive to other actors to change. And to also make it more transparent to voters. Because, of course, many populists present themselves as victims. You know, we became the biggest party, but nobody wants to play with us, etc. But unless you get 51% or 50%.1, you're not entitled to govern, okay? You don't have a right to be, in that position. But then it becomes more transparent for voters as well why, let's say, the other parties didn't play with them. Now, of course, the Social Democrats totally sold out. They didn't really develop this catalog of criteria. It was a disaster. But as an idea in the abstract, I think it's worth following.
So just to make it clear, from your perspective, so is then the question of refugees as only contingent here, from this point of view? Could be like refugees, could be something else.
I don't think populists have ever run out either of scapegoats in terms of here is yet another elite, even when populists are in power, that can be blamed for why things aren't working out, why the wall isn't being built, and so on. And at the same time, they've never run out of groups that, according to them, don't belong. They've always found another way to put it crudely and bluntly, incite hatred against particular people who they say don't quite belong to the real people. So, yes, in a sense, for some of them, I think it's hard to deny. I mean, the German populists literally said the refugees were a godsend for us. It's not me who's saying this as a diagnosis. They said it themselves. So, yes, I mean, it, of course, it has been important in terms of what we've seen over the last couple of years. But again, going back to this, the danger of monocausal explanations, I think it's naive to think that, if only the EU now finds, a really rational approach to question of borders, refugees, asylum policy, and so on, then this whole thing will disappear.
Thank you.
I'd like to chime in on three things. You said that...
Let's disagree, for God's sake.
No, whatever disagreement, but...
Exactly.
Totally d'accord about everything.
Chime in was not necessarily disagreement, but shifting it to different sort of, points of attention. You said that perhaps we need to then focus on the European level. I think so too. I mean, the basic argument of my book is that if we observe, in the sheer sense of analytical observation, is that under whatever thing, be that the modernization or the EU or the Euro or whatever, we have breaking societies and breaking party systems in most of EU countries. Then there is a problem with national democracy, so perhaps it should be time to rebuild a European democracy. And not only that the EU as itself is sort of a flawed democracy, which is sort of in all the textbooks that we can read about parliament with no right to vote and sort of the institutional logic of the EU institutions, which nobody gets. Perhaps it's just time that if we observe that apparently we have a system in which is so much squeezed to whatever socio-economic pressure on the nation states, that these nation states' democracy is no longer functioning, where the European democracy is not yet functioning, and that it's time to, democracy is falling between two chairs, which is national democracy, European democracy, lifted up to European level. That would be the first offer, and that is essentially the idea that we rethink who is the sovereign in the system, and the sovereign is always the citizen. It's never the EU, it's not the nation state, it's the political body that we constitute, and so the next body we should constitute or might be constituting is Europe. I'm saying this because Jan was so much focusing on the anti-plural argument, which is the populists feel like you don't represent the whole political body. But that's why in my book, The Civil War, I picked up on this, Giorgio Agamben book, which is the Civil War as Paradigm of Politics. And that's precisely the moment which Agamben describes as the moment where none of competing, what is Menge in English? Eine Menge von Leuten. A fool?
Menge.
A mass of people where is a mass of people standing in opposition to another mass of people who wants fundamentally different things, and no one of the two masses can claim to represent the entire political body. In the paradigm of Agamben, this is the status of political war, because it's not unversöhnlich, it's not reconciliable. Sorry, my French is getting in. Reconcilable, yeah? So you have to, like Pegida in Germany and parts of Europe. You would bet that both are German citizens, yeah, but probably reconcilable, not reconcilable, parts of Europe and Pegida. So who represents the German people? Pegida or parts of Europe. Yeah, and in different, or on peace party and those who are demonstrating against, or peace abortion laws and those who are in the streets against. So who represents the Polish people? Who is the British people in times of Brexit? Is that the Brexiters or is this the anti-Brexiters? It's not so easy to detect. And if you basically have a split of mass against mass, with no of the masses representing the political body, the argument of Agamben is that this, in theory, is the state of civil war, and so the political body needs to be reconstituted. If that is the historical moment we are in, Stefan Zweig gave us this very nice sentence, die Zeitgenossen können nicht sehen, in welchem Zustand der Geschichte sie sind. So the temporary agents cannot see the historical process in which they are in. So we are in a sort of birth channel, and we are experiencing this split of societies in which we have mass against mass. All our, say, political bodies are breaking apart. It might be the moment to reconstitute as European political body. Give me a second. Yeah? So that is the other was about the post-party and what is the party system and imploding party system and so. I'd just like to bring in say, a different argument, which perhaps we are facing post-party systems. Perhaps the use is about blockchain democracy. Perhaps we are heading for a post-institutional age, because we no longer need banks, because you do PayPal from citizen to citizen. We are P2P people, yeah, from people to, we are organizing people-to-people democracy. Can we say that in the 21st century with bots and whatever is around, we still need parties to be the representatives of our volonté générale? Perhaps we can make an argument that we still just do not know what the internet is doing with our democracies. We experience this badly for the moment. We have the Facebook things and the GAFA and what they do to democracy, and we experience this badly. No, we know that the other side of the river are using all these social networks really smarter perhaps than us, and it's our problem. But here's the thing. If you go back to Hitler, the new media are always to the populist. Hitler could win not because the German newspapers were printing his speeches in the 1920s, but because he got the Volksempfänger. Hitler came through the radio, which by then was the new medium. Because the new medium always has the egalitarian factor. The internet is a totally egalitarian media. Everybody can write its shit, everybody can read everybody's stuff, and you have no more filter and control. So the new media has a truly egalitarian aspect, and whether you're a high-ranking super-duper journalist who wrote 20 years for the New York Times, your blog isn't more worse than of whoever populist who writes in the same blog, right? And so I think there's something to think about what the new media does to our democracy and what it does with respect to populism. So that was that was it, I think. But if you take this, the paradigm of civil war, which I offer, then the real question is, can we make something out that for Europe so as to not necessarily being in the need to frame all this populist or so movement badly? The figure I have, because I checked a little bit the figures, for now, we feel like there's one country after the other falling into populism, like Hungary is already sort of fallen, Poland, now Austria, Geert Wilders, Macron just avoided France to fall into populism. But if you measure in the sense of, if you take this offer of European citizenship, yeah, then we have 510 million citizens. And Austria, for instance, is a small country like the Netherlands are a small country, like Hungary is a small country. It's basically three countries each at 8 million or so.
Ulrike, but you're writing in your book, you're claiming that even Germans understood after everything why Europe matters, why European interest is at least same important as German interest. And after it, we have election, and you have new Eurosceptical party coming back to the parliament. AfD coming to the parliament. Schulz is losing the most Euro enthusiast. And so how do you want to have your European Union?
I agree, but if you measure sort of the populist vote, sort of accumulated, by aggregated, not by country, then you have something like a 70-30 divide. It's just because we are always thinking like Austria is gone, Hungary is gone, whatever, yeah? But it's small countries in relation to the number of European citizens. So if we could skip that sort of national aggregation in the voting, yeah? But I mean, the if might be the
easiest thing to
look,
do.
but I mean, are we still in times where political sort of battles can be fought? I'm just offering something that we project ourselves into a moment in time where the nation state may be under different pressure, under much state of erosion, and where at least in terms of the figures, the moment we were to understand ourselves as European citizens, which might be around the corner and might be not, but might be around the corner, then my argument is just you measure all the populist data. In addition, you have 510 million European citizens, and roughly the ratio is 70-40 for those who want Europe. And this is two-thirds majority, and that is sufficient to do Europe.
But add to the populists, they do not want it. Mainstream politicians, almost incomplete, they also don't want to go to the supranational level, and then the amount is 90%.
But that's why I'm offering regions and the European Republic. It's much more smarter, and if then you count the sort of the personalities, I mean, look at the movement of Scottish. Look at what is going on in science. Look at what is going on in Catalonia. I mean, if you know, we are clinging to that sort of nation state because it's now here, obviously. But there's no biological sort of ontology of the nation states we are in. You see my point, yeah? So.
Okay.
And obviously it's massive, and obviously it's path dependent, and obviously it's there. But you are not going to tell me that history is ending with the borders we have now and with the states we are in now. I mean, this is completely ahistoric, so something else will come. And the real question is what comes after the status quo we are in. And that there is something coming, I think this is to be grasped in the air. So the real question is, can we shape that process to something, say, more European, if my 70-30 sort of thing is right, or are we more succumbing to a nationalistic regression just because some conservatives elite are instrumentalizing losers of modernization and are against the refugees? That's the question I put on the table. I would rather urge ourselves to go into that battle.
Jan, you wanted
to just two. I mean, look, we have to disagree. Otherwise, you know, so just 2 quick points. So I don't believe that we're entering an age of so-called post-representative politics, which is not to say that, nothing changes, there's nothing important going on. There are many important questions on the table, for instance, about the relationship between movements and parties. And it's obviously in many countries a supremely important question, how civil society relates to parties. Many people at demonstrations say we don't want parties around here, but then without parties, how do you win elections? So there's lots to talk about in terms of what particular age we live in and how we puzzle out these particular categories and strategies. But I don't think that, you know, we're going to get away from parties as prime instruments of making our democracy work. Now, second point, specifically to sort of the Europeanization that you advocate. On one level, I would agree, but I would phrase it a bit differently, and maybe in ways that you don't like. So in certain ways, you can say that, yes, the EU is an incomplete state-building project. It has sort of a common money, and it has sort of common borders. Now, money and borders we usually associate with the state. And that doesn't mean that, you know, nothing new could happen. It doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. But yes, there's a genuine question here. But that's different from saying, oh, we're going to solve the problem of populism, or we're going to solve the problem of, you know, pesky little countries like Hungary that, you know, aren't doing democracy anymore by Europeanizing. Because there's a difference between the game and the rules of the game. Democracy is not about reconciliation. It's not about consensus. It's about conflict. And conflict is entirely legitimate as long as we can reconcile ourselves to the outcomes and can sort of agree on the procedures. And the issue is clearly with parties that basically say, okay, we're going to completely not observe or change the rules of the game. And footnote to the footnote, problem is, of course, that especially in Western Europe, there is now sometimes the tendency to say, well, you know, our poor brothers and sisters in Poland and Hungary, they need more time to really understand democracy. They brought these horrible people to power and so on. But the irony is that you could tell the story exactly the other way around. That, you know, in the face of a, to some degree, corrupt, mendacious socialist party in Hungary, people did exactly what you're supposed to do in a two-party system. You bring the other people to power. And of course, Orban in 2010 didn't say, hey, vote for me, new constitution, abolition of the rule of law, end of media pluralism, and so on and so forth. No, made a point of saying, I'm completely normal, just the other party. And correct me if I'm wrong, but 2015 in this country, of course, also was all about saying, don't worry, it's not going to be like the last time, we just like families, want to do something nice for families, and so on. Nobody said, hey, vote for me, I'll decapitate the Constitutional Tribunal. So to kind of blame the people, I think is completely wrong, and I don't see how, in a sense, lifting the game up to an even higher level is going to help us deal with people who are not willing to respect the rules of the game, no matter what kind of context they're in.
Okay, now it gets really good. First, some tension here. I mean, just that little feminist thing that now if we are talking movements like Macron, like Kurz, it's all about young men. And there is a question there. What is happening that we need young men now? I mean, just put this on the table. But it's sort of interesting. And Christian Lindner, I said this when we had this Vorbesprechung here. But as a German sort of women citizen, I needed to have a YouTube clip campaigning from Christian Lindner in underwear, which is a sexist statement, Had Angela Merkel done a YouTube clip for elections in a negligee, I guess that the German boulevard press had eaten her, But Christian Lindner, it was sort of smart and sexy to have FDP sort of youngsters sitting there in underwear. I just make this feminist footnote because I'm the woman on the panel. More interestingly is that all this what... you're laughing.
Men are known to occasionally have said feminist things too.
Occasionally. Hashtag me too. More interestingly, what we are discussing is what Ferdinand Tönnies, I think in 1870, would write about when he had that distinction between, in Germany, Gemeinschaft und Gesellschaft. Right? So the moment populists frame politics back as Gemeinschaft, which is what Hitler did when he occupied the wisdom of Tönnies in a way to go. In Germany, it's easier to say, but you cannot be in schlechter Gesellschaft. You can be in schlechter Gesellschaft, but you cannot be in schlechter Gemeinschaft. You can be in bad society, but not in bad community, because the community has a selection of the people who are like you, so they cannot be bad. It's about ethnicity or religion, those who belong to my religion, those who belong to my ethne, and so on and so forth, But the moment we go back to community framing in terms of politics, it gets dangerous, and that's precisely what the populists do. So if Jan, and that's what you did sort of 2 or 3 sentences ago, you were saying, what is this lifting up to the European level all about? If people, are still struggling, and these retarded Poles and these retarded Hungarians don't get it, here is my point. I think it's a moment in time to realize that we are no longer talking about the Hungarians and not the Poles. We are talking about those who are committed to carry the heritage of the French Revolution, which is égalité, fraternité, liberté, and those who want to go back to community, Gemeinschaft, in the sense of Tönnies. In that sense, the offer of my framing is that we do go for politics as conflict, but we do it in politics tops nation schemes where the contours of where the conflict is no longer the sort of national state border, but as I said, I have more in favor with the French people who go for Macron than I have in common with Germans going for Pegida, and so on and so forth. So that is the offering, whether yes or no, we are in that moment of history where we can live up to a political conflict, which is precisely pointing to my 70-30, in which the 70, which are on, Europe, can have a conflict political battle on the European democracy we want to build against, in this case, against the other 30, who you can count, who are on the populist sort of Gemeinschaft argument.
You want to answer?
Just one sentence,
okay.
Really.
I don't believe
so democracy doesn't work without what political scientists sometimes call very cruelly losers' consent. If losers aren't willing to accept the results, if they don't accept being outnumbered, if they say, gezählt, aber nicht gewählt, we have a problem. And I don't quite see how shifting things to the European level is going to address that, given that already in a national framework, a lot of these people aren't really willing to give that losers' consent. I think we have to address it differently, as opposed to saying, in Europe we're going to have a huge majority in favor of more Europe.
But the question is not about the winners. The question is about the losers.
Listen, I think it's, you don't talk on the same level. I think that, and it's a trap of the left today, because I don't know if you agree with me, but left is getting far and far away from the idea of EU, like look at the Corbyn and so on. Why? I think that the idea is that, and it's not only my idea, I think that the problem is that once they started to challenge the neoliberal agenda, which was possible on the state level, not only on the state level, but if they wanted to regain the people or enforce the people vis-à-vis market players, they had to recapture the state. Okay, this is why they concentrated on the state. In the same time as a trap, because this way they will never regain the economic sovereignty. You can, in a sense, that there are other market players, and they are much stronger than the national state. So what you're talking about is quite formal and includes only this political surface, in a sense that people are on the same of both levels. Okay, that's actually your point. So they can behave in the same way when they see the populist invitation. Okay, but the thing is that the mainstream politics will never offer them the real influence, being so weak as they are now, operating only inside the state. Your Minister of Finance, or like Polish Minister of Finance, if he's not a populist, can offer a very little field of maneuver, okay? Because if he will announce tomorrow we're gonna launch huge investment, the consequence that the deficit will go higher, but as an investment we will pay it after a year, 2, 3. Financial market with this short-term benefit perspective will never accept it. You can do it if you are a large player, but you must be a supranational player. So the society that will regain this influence can again vote for non-populist actors. This is how I understand your point. The point is that we have this blockade because we don't have this mechanism that you were talking about.
Thanks for the question. Obviously, I'm advocating sort of my soul cries for Europe thing, but yes, I know that my argument has a weakness, and it's precisely the weakness you pointed to, which is if you want to frame it that way, yeah, and you say in a more, cynical way, we did the market, common market, single currency, and we had economic drivers. And the economic drivers for that process were the banks and the industries, especially the German industry. And German industry is still not only the economic driver of the whole thing, it's also the problem for the left of all the other countries. We know this. I mean, read the stuff of Mélenchon, read the stuff of Frédéric Lordon. I mean, this is in tendency, and not only in tendency, this is openly anti-German, and because it's anti-German, it's anti-European, because sort of there is this no German Europe argument, yeah? And it's a fair and valid argument. So obviously I'm in total acknowledge about sort of the problematic German role and the problematic export path of German industry in the structure of the single market, yeah? So either that is revisited, or probably the euro will not survive anyway in its current form. If you want to read a good German text on this, read the Leviathan, which is the current Leviathan on, the 27 Heft 3. There's a very good article from Fritz Scharp analyzing the German dominance of the export structure and what it did to the Eurozone and how we changed all the southern countries from basically single market dependency to export dependency, and what that did to the societies of the south. So there is that argument, yeah? But if you now say precisely of that argument, there was the French desire to go for different Europe, das andere Europa. So society would have, the social democratic Europe, the European unemployment scheme, whatever you frame as social and democratic Europe, which would be there. And then you make, just as an analytical constat, that this different Europe, the social democratic Europe never came across. Yeah? And that is precisely what Mélenchon and these people argue. Then the real question is, why is this so? And the answer, in a more cynical way, is because civil society, to enforce that, has no economic driver. German export industry is just happy to press the single market like a citron without delivering on a European unemployment scheme. Yeah? So what would be the economic driver for German export industry to change that? Just civil society and Ulrike Guérot, who sits in Krytyka, Polityczna, dreaming from a European republic? Probably not enough. So I know this, but we need to deal with this question. Because if we lose that battle, the real problem is that the only other option which has an economic driver is either the split of the Eurozone in whatever time frame or whatever, ultimately a war, because wars do have an economic driver, and renationalization and so on and so forth is always building a we against another we, and we will solve that differently than 100 years ago, but it will not be sort of a pony ride.
It's getting a little bit late, and I would like to include you in the debate. So I'm not going to ask. I will just bring two small points that actually that I will actually refer to what Jan wrote in the book, because we should put them in the table. I think that Jan very, very smartly presented the interesting pendulum that created post-war liberal democracy, which is as an experience of the disasters of 20th century. The pendulum was shifted from the national sovereignty to the rule of law. Security, let's put it this way. So, to put it like this is especially relevant for Poland and the constitutional court and all the rules of actually the rule of law and all the liberal rules of separation of power and all of it that actually doesn't refer directly to the will of the people and to the ballot, but secures liberal democracy from what have happened by democratic tools in Germany or in Italy and so on. So what's going on now is actually this shift of pendulum in another way. So because people forgot what happened or they have different experience, they do not see in the same way the importance of this independent from elections, so just unelected independent institutions, okay, like constitutional court, and this is why they agreed to destroy them much easier than the people would do in 60s, 50s, or 70s, okay. And the societies want to feel more sovereign, want to have more influence, also from economic reasons, okay. So this is what I would like to, because it's again not about economy. So this is I would like to bring it to the table. And one of my questions to everybody would be that maybe we should divide the populism to the two ways, because if you compare Kaczynski's government, 2005-2007, it was the most neoliberal government in the Polish third history. If you look what's going on now, they launched the largest social transfers in the Polish history, okay? And they actually rebuilt not only the political scene, but the social-economic factors, like the society. If you look at the data, the poorest people, 60% vote for peace, 6% for PO. And if you look at the numbers in the opinion polls concerning entrepreneurs, 60% would support the idea of coming back to power platform, civic platform, 0%, which actually never happened in social polling, in public polling, would support the idea of peace continuation. Okay, so we have a class war. today, which is actually something different than what you observe, for example, in the United States.
And you are in a way lucky that you have a say populist party who is in the sort of best sense of the word national social, right? Because the problem, whatever is, if there's that class that the AfD is not national social but national neoliberal, and that the fight of the current Front Marine Le Pen is whether she was national social, but she is going now, that's my bet, national neoliberal.
Exactly.
Yeah?
Peace hijacked the most attractive parts of socialism and fascism in the same time, unfortunately. Okay, how many questions do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, good. Exactly. So let's collect them, if you agree. Okay, and let me please put it short. Make it short.
Good evening. I wanted to come back exactly to the point you made with this power split in Europe, with this German domination. So what I don't understand, this power situation, this power split and this power dominance is given. How you want to change it? We all know that it will be really, Germany would never accept any change in the European Parliament, which you were talking about in your interview on 10th of August. There is no way to it. But if there is no way to it, so maybe we have to find another solution of the problem. Moreover, the European Union, as you put it, was a common market. And it is still a common market. Even you can see it because 70 or 80% of all the budget is going to agriculture, to steel, to coal, and so on and something. And to culture, I don't know whether it is 5% even. So this is not a cultural political union. It is not. So, and I think it should be forbidden to talk about populists. We should talk about our own concept, what we like to have, what we see. We have to change because our system was producing this counter movement, because the populist movements are counter movements. They are against something. They are not bringing it on their own. So that's.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. You mainly talked about right-wing populism. And I was wondering, because as Professor Müller mentioned, populism doesn't have content, so it can go both ways. So I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about left-wing populism, and specifically I wanted to hear your thoughts on Jeremy Corbyn, and whether you think that the Labour Party is actually playing this role of collaborators that you mentioned for right-wing parties.
Okay, so you said that protests are often counterproductive and exploited by populists to their benefit, actually. And you advise protesters to be more clever and more sophisticated. So I would like to ask you, what do you mean by this?
Like unite, disunite, it what way? In what way?
I would like to make a very simple observation. I think that there is one big difference between the populism in the west part of Europe and in our part of Europe. I think I'm not a very attentive political observer, but I think that even populism in Western Europe does not attack the institutions themselves, the liberal democratic institutions. Whereas in our part of Europe, our guys are trying to dismantle the system, which I think is much more dangerous than in your part of the world. But that was an observation. Another observation from which I derive a question. The observation is that we're now talking in this room among people who are kind of educated, they understand the public matters, etc. But the simple statistics from recent public poll in Poland is that during the last year, 67% of our citizens in this country did not read even one book.
But the book, they understand 15 pages.
Yes.
I mean,
yeah. And those who are frequent readers would be those who read more than 7 books to make it. And it's like 10% or something like this. So my question is, to whom are we talking now? Aren't we sort of cooking ourselves in our own system? And what to do in order to reach to those who listen to the populists? And this is the question. But then I have kind of support for the answer. I like very much, Ulrike, your idea of supranational activism. I think it's great. But then we need to understand that people are not educated. And now I'm talking about those majorities, these silent majorities. People are not educated, and when I say educated, I mean education about the basics of democracy and political life, polis. People feel left alone. They feel decoupled. And regardless of the fact that this may be a subjective feeling, we, the elites, broadly speaking, have to do something with that. So we have really left those people away. We didn't care enough.
Thank you very much. And now, if anybody else we can include 1 or 2 questions if they will be also short. If not, then let me either answer or make a conclusion. Ulrike? Przepraszam. The angle is, I can't see the right-wing angle.
Yeah, hi, just a very quick observation. In the discussion of the rise of Trump and the rise of Brexit, there's been a lot of ink spilt in the British and American presses about losers of neoliberalism, losers of globalization, and how that creates that rise. But I just wanted to hear your thoughts about the role of middle-class supporters of populist parties in Western Europe in particular, and why you think that might have been left out of the analysis.
Anyone else want to join in? Okay.
If I start now, that's in verse order from the beginning. Look, let me start, especially the first and the third question. I will go there with this quote from Václav Havel. Hope is not to do something in order to make things better. Hope is to do things because you think that it is good to do them, even if things do not get better, right? And that is basically the mood on which I am placing myself. I think this is a very nice quote, yeah? So if we go into analysis about bloody figures, about the article of Yasha Mank, who tells us that 50% of European youth is no longer believing in democracy, that young men, let alone those who are not qualified, are going into militarism and the whole thing, then you don't go to sleep. Or you go to sleep with headaches, whatever, yeah? So that is why, in difficult times I always write quotes with lipstick on my bath mirror, and that's the Havel quote I have with lipstick these days, yeah? It's very important.
So
yeah?
you can write also with your lipstick that Havel never won any common popular election, never.
Fine. Still he was important.
Always was elected by the parliament.
The other quote I go with is for the European Republic is Gandhi. First they will laugh at you, then they will ignore you, then they will fight you, but then you will win. Yeah. But here's my point. How to change the Germans was your question. Believe me, and this is not about ego tripping. Yeah. My book has been sort of a bestseller. Yeah. And I spent 2 years literally being each and every evening in any given town of Germany you may know or not know. And there were towns I would even know myself. Yeah, from Lübeck to Freiburg, from Dresden to Cologne. I don't tell you that I spoke to Köln-Chorweiler or the Marzahn people or the whatever Hartz IV people. But they never run politics in Germany. But I talked to the distinguished, say, the normales Bürgertum, say, the 300 people you find in Hanover, in Köln, in Dresden, and so. And wherever I went, I got a full room of Germans who totally understand that if the Germans are not giving up the position of animal farm in the Euro governance, the whole thing will torpedo. And my hope is just that this can built as a mayonnaise. I spent a lot of energy, personal energy, in building this argument, and I will talk, for instance, to be very precise, I will talk to the Pulse of Europe people next Sunday on the market of Frankfurt, and it will go to 70,000 of Pulse of Europe people, and then it will go into the network, and obviously we will do a statement for those who are building the coalition in Berlin, and at least that is the way to go with Václav Havel. Not saying that it will change something, but at least you know why you are doing that thing. I think we all agree in the analysis that with that sort of German course in the economic structure it will not work. But my trust and confidence comes from the fact that I experienced for 2 years that I can change the mindset of German people if you are talking to them properly. And that gives hope. Yeah? So let's just assume for a second that it might be enough. The question about here is this, the populists are doing systemic change and then it changes, and you see like there's a difference between East and West. I don't see this. I was scared about the NSU process in Germany. I am scared that in the Wahlomat, the thing you do to go for elections in Germany, this sort of internet questioning, the first question was, do you agree on having the army in the streets? Which is, let's say, a non-constitutional question, because there's no ground of employing the army in Germany. So we wiped that out of the constitution. So the sheer fact that you have this in a Wahlomat question tells you that there's also precisely what Jan-Werner says, the systemic sort of thought shift at work, because we allowed to have that question in the Wahlomat. And I bet that 5 years ago would not have been in the Wahlomat, because it's not constitutionally grounded. So it's all about education. But here's the other thing. I'm now in a provincial university in Krems an der Donau, which has 12,000 sort of citizens. You get a room of 400 people in the Minoritenkirche there to talk about Europe. People are not silly. I'm still a believer that you can do this, that we all can do this if we are up to education and up to going out and up to talk easy. And I would still bet that these sort of normal people or the non-reading people or the, however we call them, the non-reading whatever, that if you want, that you can lift them, and that is what they desire. Because the difference between a politician which is populist and a non-populist is that the one who is not populist always tries to lift people. And to lift people in the sense of Willy Brandt, that is, Politik ist die Erziehung zur Vernunft, and not going to the bad instincts of people, and you feed the bad instincts because you think you can win elections with this. And I am honestly convinced that so-called ordinary people understand this, and they understand when you give them arguments to be lifted up, and they understand why they are caught for bad instincts. And I think that's the chance we have. And, I'm doing a lot of this these days in Austria and in Germany, so that's the only thing I can say. But I think you're right. It's about education, 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 and going out. This is live streamed, so perhaps we are winning 3 of the non-reading polls with this event. But I'm definitely convinced that even ordinary people who are not into theory of democracy can understand whether they are caught by non-moral arguments or whether they are lifted up to reasons. And that is the task we have in front. So on that question I think I hand the other 2 questions over to Jan. I just want to say on the question of, this class, racial, religious politics and so, for France, it's really evident that what we are experiencing is, and that probably feeds into why our party systems are exploding, because the political contours on which they are imploding are getting messed up. There is class, there's race, there's religion, and there's politics. In France, it's really obvious, because Ségolène Royal was the last one who got something like 90% of the young Boers, or the Arab vote in the French banlieues, for a socialist program on more social distribution. When did Hollande lose that Arab young vote for the social sort of argument? He lost it when the French socialists decided to go for homosexual marriage. Because then the Arabs put religion, anti-homosexual, over social distribution. And so, because now the race, class, gender, politics argument is messed up, I guess, in most of our societies, that is why the party system has so much problem, because if you say you are poor, then it's still a difference whether you are an Arabic poor or you are non-Arabic poor in France, for instance, but not only in France. It's the same in the UK. And here we go with party systems which apparently cannot reflect that messing up of the political criteria on which you base party systems, and that might be an argument. So I think we need to reshuffle all this. I hope we can get through more education, and that is from my side.
It's a hard act to follow also in terms of its uplifting message at the very end, but I'll try my best. Especially if you come from America, people expect some positive message at the end. So, just one thing, I agree with your observation empirically that, if you want to put it that way, Central and Eastern European populists and Western European populists are different. But that's, I think, only because Western European populists don't have the power. So I'm not saying that if they're a small coalition partner in a government, we're going to expect the end of democracy. But I'm pretty sure that if they had enough power, they wouldn't be so different from an Orban or a Kaczynski. And Marine Le Pen, for instance, has occasionally dropped hints that she also has ideas about what to do about constitutional courts. So I don't think it's any sort of deep cultural divide. It's simply about who has the power and who doesn't. Question about Corbyn. So from my point of view, neither Corbyn nor, for the matter, Sanders are populists. I simply don't believe that they are anti-pluralists, that they think they are the representatives of the real people, and so on and so forth. Now, maybe that feeds into the wider question of what do people mean when they talk about left-wing populism or the supposed desirability of left-wing populism. Well, sometimes one feels all they really mean, and sometimes say quite openly, is that, okay, we have to sort of connect with people more emotionally, or the world is so complex, we kind of have to put things in simpler terms. Now, even if you believe that as a good social democrat, I think you bloody well shouldn't say it openly. It's a little bit like the Clinton campaign in the summer of 2015 when they said, our project for the fall is to make her look more human. Well, even if that is your project, you don't announce it, okay? You don't have this patronizing attitude where you basically say, our voters don't really understand the world, and we kind of, have to sort of condescend to them. So that's relatively trivial. If one means by left-wing populism, in the way that, let's say Mouffe and Laclau used to mean, in a sense, a left-wing program in the previous pre-populist iteration, that the left has to kind of regain cultural hegemony and rebuild the common sense of a society, I have no problem with that. The question then is, why do you need the language of populism on top of that? What is going to generate that as a kind of political surplus value? And I don't mean to say that, one election gives us proof of, whether a theory is right or wrong. But it's maybe not entirely trivial to observe that, in a sense, Mélenchon tried this very explicitly. If you compare the 2012 and the 2017 Mélenchon campaign, the languages were very different. And not to put too fine a point on it, the 2017 campaign was a lot less universalist, had a lot more people talk. Now, what was the result? Did he manage to get lots of people back from the National Front? No. It was a tiny, tiny part of the population that switched. I'm not saying that's decisive or therefore we should abandon these theories, but it clearly isn't as simple as sometimes people on the left like to believe. They read Didier Eribon and they come away and they say, oh, basically right-wing populism is what Bebel called, socialism for fools, and all we have to do is explain to people patiently that, neoliberalism is their real enemy, and then everything will fall into place. So in that sense, at least for me, the case has yet to be made that the left really has to gain a lot from populism talk in general. And I would certainly be very opposed, of course, against the background of my own theory, to any sort of left-wing approach that comes down to a total anti-pluralism. Okay, protest. So on the one hand, I think we face a real puzzle. If you had said to somebody 10 or 20 years ago that we are facing regimes which on paper all remain committed to democracy. So nobody has said, okay, end of democracy, we have a better system, we believe in bureaucratic authoritarianism, or we dream the Chinese dream. And yet you want to say, okay, we have to oppose these regimes. Everybody would have said, oh, it's obvious what you do. You do civil disobedience. Because that is basically telling people that we all have the same principles. You appeal to majorities, or at least large parts of the population, on the basis of shared ideals. And yet that doesn't seem to be working somehow. Now, I think on one level, there's a problem maybe with strategy and tactics. And that, my suspicion, is very context dependent. I think in some contexts, you basically need to find a way of saying, okay, all parties, all movements rally around one candidate against the person in power. So kind of the Otpor script, which many people now I think are very skeptical about, but under certain conditions, I think that might still be a plausible thing. But in other contexts, you might need different strategies and tactics. But what I think is not very context dependent is the fact that the institutional infrastructure, not just for protest, but for democracy in general, has changed. You touched upon this at a certain point. In the old days, we all loved a particular Danish fairy tale, where it takes just one child to point out that the emperor is naked. And then everybody says, oh, now we see it. But of course, the premise of the fairy tale is that everybody can hear the child. And we now live in a world of highly segmented public spheres, where a lot of people are simply not going to know about things, hear about things, perceive certain things in a way that you think, I mean not you, but all of us in general, think is obvious. So one sort of very striking example, I think, from the United States. There's a center at Harvard that revisited the election, the 2015-16 election campaign. And they looked at sort of what were the topics associated with the candidates. And this applied across all media. So not just, Breitbart internet stuff, but TV, print, everything put together. And for Clinton, the three biggest bars that go up as a graph are, you might not find it surprising, emails, the foundation, Benghazi. Everything else doesn't register. So her economic message certainly didn't go anywhere. But contrary to a widespread opinion now, it's also not true that everybody was obsessing about transgender bathrooms. And that's why, the working class said, oh, no, we don't want that. No, that doesn't register either. But in the case of Trump, there's basically only one bar that goes up, and that's immigration. So the idea that, okay, at the very least, here's a topic, and I watch, whatever you think is left in the US, MSNBC, and they spin it this way, and then I watch Fox, and they spin it another way, still has the rather naive assumption that everybody knows about the same topics or the same themes. And it turns out, no, with certain media, the topic isn't even there. The theme isn't there. So that's, I think, the real challenge, is to kind of break through these segmented public spheres. Now, do I have a panacea how to do that? No, but I think to some degree all you can do is actually directly one-on-one engage with real-world citizens. I think there's a tiny lesson maybe in how the Austrian presidential election unfolded in 2016. Again, remember, this was ultimately a very unexpected outcome, but the Van der Bellen campaign, I think, was very successful in telling its potential supporters, people who were willing to kind of be mobilized, look, you got to go out there and you need to talk to people directly. So go to parts of Vienna that you otherwise never go to, knock on people's doors, talk to them. Don't tell these people after 2 minutes that they're really racist and fascist, because then it's not going to be very productive and fruitful. Find a way to break through that populist imagination of totally homogeneous people and talk about topics that people don't know about or maybe don't want to hear about initially. So it's a very traditional thing to do, but I think you just need the kind of man or woman power to actually mobilize people and break through these new structures. And then also I think there are sort of more particular counter strategies you can do online in terms of how you kind of go against certain things on social media. Again, I'm not an expert on this. I don't want to pretend that I have, the 3 bullet points of, here's the manual how everybody could do this. But if you think of, one very successful example in our day, the so-called Operation Libero in Switzerland, where again people said you cannot go against the Swiss People's Party on the topic of immigration. Nobody can possibly win against them. And these very smart young people actually, partly through very smart use of social media, were able to swing that. So I think that's the kind of direction I would look in terms of institutional infrastructure or strategies which I think generally apply beyond specific situations where it's very tactics and strategy dependent, given the overall constellation of forces, which I realize is not a very satisfying answer, and above all, isn't really the positive flourish at the end that we should finish on.
Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting.